All right, we're live.
Welcome to our first webinar, a new era in demand forecasting for the food and beverage industry. I'm your host, Greg Foster, founder and CEO of Vizen Analytics. Join me in welcoming our featured subject matter experts. Say hello to Pablo Cussatti, Chief Supply Chain Officer for Godiva, Chocolatier out of New York, and Nathan Mays, Consulting Director for DIAGMA, a leading supply chain consulting and logistics firm out of Seattle, Washington. So let's have both of you tell us a little bit about yourselves, beginning with Pablo, and then we'll get the program started.
Sure, thanks, Greg. Pablo Cussatti, Chief Supply Chain Officer for Godiva, Chocolatier. I've been in the food industry for about 30 years, always working in food operations, manufacturing, and supply chain. And I've been on the board of Vizen Analytics since March.
And we are very glad to have you.
And my name's Nathan Mays. I'm background in industrial engineering before I got into consulting. I work with DIAGMA, which is actually a France-based consulting company, and I'm director of the US operations here in Seattle.
Awesome. Let's go to the next slide. And there we all are. And let's go to the next slide after that, I think, or nope, let's go one back. Perfect. Okay, so today we're here to discuss the food and beverage industry and what to make of all the change and disruption we're seeing up and down the consumer supply chain. So I'm going to give a quick overview on the industry, and then I'm going to hand it off to Pablo, and he'll talk about how we're continuing to see shortages of our favorite supermarket products and discuss the key root cause of why that's happening, something known as the bullwhip effect. And then Nathan will take us downstream on the impact of food manufacturers and what they face in dealing with these changes in demand, including ongoing COVID-19 impact. Plus, we're going to do some relevant case studies on a food distributor, Biocoop and Alpha, a leading potato chip manufacturer, and how they're dealing with this dilemma in transforming their businesses to be better at addressing product and demand challenges. Next slide. All right, so hey, this is not about Vizen Analytics, but I want to give a quick commercial so you know who we are. So we're an early stage startup focused to support primarily the food and beverage industry to increase sustainability by reducing excess food waste. We accomplish this by getting better forecasting results, improving KPIs, including on time and full, lowering holding costs, and increasing cash flow utilizing our advanced AI SaaS solution. And as you can see, it's a very comprehensive approach. More about us later, but why don't we break into the great content of our show? Let's go to the next slide. So here's an overview of the food and beverage industry. And Pablo, feel free to comment on this. But it's about a $12 trillion industry in the United States, of which food and beverage makes up 28% of it. And it's a combination of suppliers, manufacturers, distributors, and retailers. Next slide. And so what's happened in the last 12 to 18 months is phenomenal industry disruption and change. As you can see on the left-hand side here, and these are just some examples, right? So we've seen a decline in sales that would go to hotel and restaurants or hospitality firms. We've seen an increase in frozen and pantry items, and we've seen a shift in brands. And just me personally, when I go into the store, I notice new brands, and I've started to buy new brands. So it's kind of an interesting thing. And then on the right-hand side is, so we've had COVID, and everybody knows this incredible impact that it's had last 12, 18 months. But before COVID, the market was changing already, right, guys? So we've seen a lot of changes up and down the line, you know, when you're taking a look at all of the key items that are happening, right? So you're looking at an increase in the rise of home meal kits, plant-based products, and ordering online and e-commerce. So this was already shifting. And so if you're still utilizing a demand forecasting solution that relies on your gut or your embedded knowledge, you can see where that might start to cause some challenges if the embedded knowledge now doesn't align to where the market is today. So speaking of shortages, let's talk about the consumer purchasing experiences. Pablo, if you take us through the next slide and tell us what's going on, right? So when I go to the store, and I took this trip to Mount Shasta, I stopped at different stores along the way, and we were trying to get water. We went down the water aisle, completely empty except for like one brand. And then we were looking for ice cream, and we couldn't find our favorite brand. We were looking at all these odd brands. And I've seen this in every store, and it doesn't matter what the product is. Like when we first started, it was toilet paper, right? And now it's like you go into a store and there's a different type of shortage of certain products. So maybe, Pablo, you could walk us through what you see happening in this space. It'd be awesome to take us through that.
Yeah, well, hopefully you were able to find your favorite Godiva product on the shelf at that point. But I will tell you, it's affected everybody in the industry. There is, you know, and I'll give you some examples of what happens to me on a daily basis. Is we have products coming over on container ships. And you all heard about the backups at the container at the ports in the U.S. A lot of that has to do with during COVID, we brought in so many containers, and there was so much absenteeism at the ports that they didn't have time to reload empty containers back to China. So then China had a backlog of production that got stuck in their ports, and now as they're loading things back up, it's created another backup of just insufficient amount of containers to be able to bring to the ports. And we still haven't unlocked the port traffic that we have today. And so every sort of a small adjustment can have huge impacts to the rest of the organization. And then adjustments at the, you know, and the reality is we don't really see point of sale demand. So as Walmart or the retailers start to empty out their shelves, we only get the signal once their distribution centers are empty. And by that time, their distribution centers are empty and their stores are all empty. And so not only are we trying to refill their pipeline or their distribution centers, but also of their stores at the same time. So it has a huge impact on the side. So getting those demand signals as fast as possible helps us respond better to any situation.
Yeah, so like this slide, can you tell us what these ripples indicate? I mean, like you talked about the containers coming in. There seems to be a connection between what the customer's ordering and what the supplier is delivering, right? I know you're going to talk a little bit more about the bullwhip effect, but is that what's going on in these stores? It's because it's not just COVID anymore, right? It's what COVID has created, the chaos downstream, right?
Yeah, so if you think about it, it's not necessarily just COVID, but the downstream effect has created issues that were unforeseen. And so as our containers are slow getting into the ports, and we keep out of stocking customers because we instead of taking 4 weeks to get an ocean freight, now it's taking 8 weeks to get an ocean freight. The retailers are then ordering more, creating false signals into our systems to have more demand, even though we have that demand fulfilled. So we're ordering more containers to come over and then creating more of a backlog at the ports. And then what'll happen is we finally get the containers to the ports, and then because of the amount of on the road traffic that's happening and the lack of trucks, I can't get all the containers off the ports into my distribution centers to get them distributed out to the locations, because we don't have enough trucks to pay for to get those out of the docks. On top of that, then I'm paying demurrage charges for all these containers that are sitting at the ports. So I may have the product actually sitting here in the US, but I can't get them out of the ports because of the traffic congestion that's created just in and out of the ports, and the lack of transportation equipment available to pull those containers off the ports.
Yeah, that's amazing. You want to go to the next slide there, Nathan? So when I first heard about this, Pablo, I thought it was like a college drinking game, the beer game, right? You want to walk us through this? This really is kind of what we just saw on the next slide, and you'll see even more when he illustrates it on the next slide. But share with us what is the beer game?
I don't know if there's any seasoned supply chain person who hasn't played the beer game yet. But I did this actually a couple of years ago with my team. And so we brought everybody together, and what you basically end up doing is everyone plays a different portion of this, right? So one person's the retailer, one person's the wholesaler, one person's the distributor, and one person's the manufacturer. And the signals that you send each other are basically the same signals that you have in the real world. So the retailer is sending orders to the wholesaler is sending orders to the distributor, the manufacturers are sending, or distributors are sending orders to the manufacturers, and then product moves down as the orders are getting done. And then issues happen, right? So the wholesaler may have had a truck fail and not get the order to the retailer, so the retailer starts to order more, which creates a backlog with the distributor. So all of a sudden you see all these products start to stack up all over the place, and the teams don't get to talk to each other. They just get to see the results at the end. And it's funny to see what happens throughout the whole process is you basically start to see where there's excess inventory, and almost every time you have way too much inventory in each location because no one's really seeing the errors in the forecast or the demand that's coming through the system.
So you're really saying that there's kind of a lack of visibility and therefore lack of control. And so then everyone's acting for their own self. Is that basically what you're saying in essence?
Yeah, absolutely. You know, the retailer may see a small spike in demand, so they start ordering more. The wholesaler then starts sending signals that they need more from the distributor or the manufacturer. The manufacturer starts adding shifts of production, and then all of a sudden we start clogging up the system with inventory where everybody's got to shut down because there's too much in the system. And then on a global scale is what you're seeing today with COVID and some of the impacts that you're having across the network. That's going across every supply chain network across the world.
It's fascinating. We can probably see that a little bit clearer on the next slide there, Mr. Nathan. Yeah, so you want to walk us through this. This kind of takes that to a whole new level, right? We can see the actual effect, right?
Yeah, on this one, you'll see one spike in sales creates enormous amount of disruption to the retailer's orders to the wholesaler. And go to the next one is then the orders to the wholesalers to the manufacturers start to go create even more chaos. And then the manufacturer's orders to suppliers create a huge response. And then if you've ever worked in a manufacturing organization, you just don't all of a sudden are able to produce 5 times the amount that you were in the past, right? That requires, you know, generally requires 3 months to hire and train people to get them on the shift. And then all of a sudden, if you do that in this kind of scenario, then you'll be laying those people off that you just hired and trained for 3 months for 1 month of production, basically. And, you know, in effect, we've seen this. I've personally seen this in my organization and organizations in the past. And, you know, I was just having a conversation with someone today because we're a heavily seasonal business. And a lot of our retailers are getting antsy about all the supply chain disruptions, and they're ordering ahead their holiday sales items. And I'm telling my team not to react incorrectly to these kind of false signals that are coming into the organization.
So what you think on your side, and I always like to put myself in the shoes of my customer. So how are you addressing that? How are you, and I know you're new in your current position because when we first met you were over at Ventura Foods, but how do you from your vantage point get a handle on this, right? What's your perspective on that?
Yeah, I mean, so our tools are pretty limited right now, and they have been, and even in my last role, our tools are very limited. So it's a lot of conversations with the sales teams about what's going on. Is this real? What do we do about it? How do we impact it? Do we build inventory early to make adjustments for this? But you know, it is in effect, what you end up in effect is, you know, the balance between inventory, cash flow, your cash flow, which is your inventory, the cost of the organization to react fast to these kind of disruptions, and then the service level to the customer is really a very careful balance that you have to do. And so because of those things, you end up, we for example, built up inventory early knowing there were disruptions coming. And so luckily for right now, I have a pretty good amount of inventory to be able to face some of these sort of chaotic demand that's coming into the system. And then we have to stay close with our sales partners to say, you know, do we see this trend continuing? Do we see this accelerating? Do we see this as a blip that's going to come back? You know, because what you don't want to do is sacrifice the service in the future because of an issue that's happening today. And so we have to make the right balanced choices, and it takes an enormous amount of coordination, communication, and even with that, we still make wrong decisions.
That's amazing. One little sidebar I'll give you, not in the food industry, but have any of you driven by any automobile lots, you know, where they sell cars, new cars? It's pretty shocking. It's like there used to be like hundreds of cars you could choose from on the lot, and now there's just one or two, and they have a backlog and it's overpriced. And that wasn't necessarily caused by the bullet, it was a chip shortage, right? But then there's some gaming going on, and click on some of the root causes for this, Nathan, if you don't mind. So if someone's trying to interpret, hey, we've got a limited number of cars because there's a little tiny chip that goes into it that powers, you know, all of the electronics in it. Now that chip isn't available, then what happens, right? Then all those, it's kind of like your example, Pablo, they sit on the dock because they can't turn them over. They can't commercialize those vehicles. So one tiny little change in the industry creates all these ripples. And then even if when they get all of the chips back, which I'm told by the end of this year that will be back in place, right? And this happens when you're doing food service companies and hospitality, and they've got a key ingredient that goes into their packaging, right? It's the same kind of thing. And I know, Nathan, you're going to walk us through a little bit more of the impacts on demand. But do you agree with these root causes down here? Do you think that's what's happening? Is that there's some change and then everybody overreacts to it? Is that kind of what's happening?
Oh, absolutely. We're even seeing the retailers currently overreact to some of the issues that we're finding, putting in orders earlier than we expected. So, you know, September orders are being pulled up to August because people think that the port delays are going to create issues. But what they don't recognize is those, by pulling up the orders, they're creating more issues or they're exaggerating the problem into the organization based on what you see in these charts.
Yeah, that's amazing.
And
So,
if I can add to that, Greg, I think if there's a misconception that the order is a proxy for the forecast, and if the true forecast is not being passed down the supply chain, there can be confusion and overreaction, because suppliers will think the increase in orders is an indication of higher forecast, when it's actually just a different reason. So yeah, and I think we're seeing this across the line with almost every product that's out there, and every customer has this challenge, and this may be the new normal. And so we've got to come up with better ways to be able to share this data, keeping it privatized, of course, but be able to share the impact so that everybody can kind of flatten this whole process out. And I think that's probably what's missing. Would you agree, Pablo? Is just a better software system that can give you that kind of insight and information?
Well, I've heard it somewhere said before that 1 point of forecast accuracy improvement gives you 27% improvement in customer service. And the reality is the more accurate the forecast, the easier it is for us to understand what we need to do as suppliers, as manufacturers, to be able to get to that service side. And then, like I said, customer service improvement, if we do it correctly, not only am I improving my customer service, but I can reduce my cash flow and inventory needs, and then I can more optimally serve the customer from a cost standpoint.
That's awesome. And I just look at these charts. I mean, it's just amazing, the overreaction, which creates, and the food side, because if you're making cars, you can wait a little bit. They're not going to rust out, right? But if it's food, it goes beyond its sell-by date. Either the value of that merchandise drops or it becomes food waste.
Yep,
and that's
exactly right. And we can see a lot of obsolete risk if you get the signals wrong. I mean, there's a shelf life component to what we do. The good news about the cars example is I was able to sell my used car for an exorbitant price. So that got me a benefit.
I think that happened around 11 or 12. I remember having the same thing with my Jeep, but not quite so much, not quite as good on the food side, right, Nathan? I know you're going to you're going to take us through some examples of how demand is changing on organics and potato chips, which are my favorite. So I can't wait to hear more about that. Pablo, any final thoughts on this?
No, I think it's, you know, again, the better signal that we get from the organization, the better the reaction. And like you said, it's not just a service impact, it's a cost impact too, whether it's obsolete and excess, whether it's inventory or cash flow issues that we can bring back in earlier, or whether it's just the optimization. Like if I have to hire people to run that inventory faster or earlier for 3 months and then lay them off, there's a price that we have to pay, not only from a labor impact, but also a reputational impact by, you know, on our people, right? There's a cultural impact to that.
Yeah, you mentioned that on the customer service side. So that's the big, you know, it's not just cash flow and OTIF and those kind of things. It's how does it affect the buyer and the people they're selling to and your relationship with them? So it's really important that we get better data, better signals, and be able to apply it in a way where everybody can visualize that and help improve their score. Okay, Nathan, I'm going to hand this over to you, sir. You've got some really cool things here to talk about. So
Definitely. So I'm going to dive a little bit deeper into 2 specific categories of planning issues that we commonly deal with clients in the food and beverage industry. And so one of the big categories of problems that can be faced with planning relates to exploding demand. So this kind of comes up with trendy products, but also in the pandemic, with shifts in consumer patterns, there's been a lot of exploding demand with a lot of types of food products as well. So how to effectively plan when the demand is exploding into the future. And the second big category of problems I'm going to address are how to deal with difficult products in the food and beverage industry. So examples of difficult products would be products with short shelf life, which contributes to food waste, like Pablo was talking about earlier. Also products that have volatile demand, for example, strong seasonality and weather dependence. And then also products that are bulky and fragile. For example, I'm going to talk a little bit later about a potato chips manufacturer and some of the issues associated with that difficult product.
Hope you brought some samples. We're hungry.
I'll pass them through the web.
Awesome.
So before I dive a little bit deeper into those 2 categories of problems, when we're talking about optimal operations planning, a huge part of that is having an accurate demand forecast, like Greg and Pablo were talking about earlier. But the other piece that I like to emphasize when we're working with clients is having a clear supply chain strategy. So how does your cost versus service trade-off influence your business strategy and your competitive advantage? So knowing before you enter your planning processes what is important in terms of what your customers are valuing in terms of service or cost, and how effectively balancing those 2 will give you a competitive advantage in the market is essential to knowing how to plan. So by combining a clear strategy and an accurate forecast, that can enable an operational plan that maintains the customer service that's acceptable to your customers. So things like minimizing the stock outs and maximizing probability of perfect order, while minimizing the cost associated with running the supply chain. So minimizing inventory holding costs, logistics costs, making sure there's not too much overtime labor. And then specific to food industry, making sure that food waste is minimized.
What is thank you. That's really, yeah, I agree. What does DIFOT stand for?
Delivered in full on time.
Ah,
yeah.
Delivered in full on time. Yeah, gotcha.
All right. So I'm going to jump a little bit deeper into a case study with the client that relates to this problem of how to plan when demand is exploding. So Biocoop is a $1 billion fresh, frozen, dry, organic foods distributor in Europe. They have 600 stores, 4 distribution centers, and 15 suppliers, and 5 sectors of SKUs. So fruit, veggie SKUs, other food SKUs, non-food, and then ultra fresh and frozen. And with this particular client, they're in the organic foods market, which was increasing at an 11% year-over-year growth. Some years that was as high as 25%. But hugely fashionable product or group of products, and the challenge was how to avoid having shortages, since the amount of organic producers wasn't enough to meet the growing demand in the market. And so that presented a huge planning challenge. And another associated challenge was, as this organic food market grows, how does Biocoop maintain its market share? Because the more players come into the market, the market share tends to decrease for fashionable products such as these. So a few planning ingredients that we threw into the pot when working with this client were focusing on the medium-term forecast. So not just looking over the next year or the next few months, but making sure that there was a process to create a medium-term 1 to 2 year forecast, and then using that forecast as an input into the supplier contracts processes to make sure that Biocoop stayed on top of its supplier contracts so that it will be able to meet this medium-term exploding demand. But another ingredient was, after creating the forecast, making sure that that was passed on to the suppliers, which requires trust in between the suppliers and the distributor. But that can help eliminate things such as the bullwhip effect, like Pablo was talking about earlier. So in this case, the outcome of incorporating these planning ingredients was helping to maintain that customer service rates, minimizing stockouts, and then also making sure the optimal planning led to reduction in controlled stocks.
Got it. So I imagine you had to use some kind of a process to do scenario planning, right? To be able to figure out what that 1 to 2 year forecast is. Is that correct?
That's right. So yeah, we used a process to make sure that they were creating this medium-term forecast and then using that forecast as an input into these contract development processes.
And then you're looking at organic foods, right, Pablo? So, that's an unpredictable market. We know it's growing, but it's also still fluctuating. And then, how it's branded and marketed. And I know you're going to go through that with the potato chip example, which I love. Do you have any thoughts on that, Pablo, in terms of how you manage like new products or a key ingredient that your buyers want included in the chocolate, or have you gotten that far downstream yet?
Look, it's well, I've worked in the vegetable markets in the past, and it is a complicated. You never know what the harvest is going to bring, and so if you're not hedging yourself correctly on an annual basis, you could be in a lot of trouble. And then the reality is it's not so easy to swap SKUs in the food, drug, and mass environment, right? So Walmart, if you're telling them that you're gonna service them with this SKU, isn't all of a sudden going to say be understanding just because you didn't get the crops that you expected that year, and say, okay, well, we'll swap it out for something else. They'll just delist you from their organization. And yeah, we're struggling in a lot of areas. We have a very unique chocolate SKUs that have some very unique flavors in them, and we're finding it, especially due to the strain in the global environment, harder and harder to get a lot of the products out and into our hands so that we can produce them.
Yeah, no, I know that's challenging for a lot of us. And I seem to recall from talking to Drew, our Director of Strategic Initiatives and co-founder, he's really interested on the agricultural side. And so he's always stressing to me, Greg, you don't get it. Organic crops, you can't just, plant them tomorrow and they pop, the next week. They have to really plan this, right? Because there's only so many fields that actually have organics. I'm sure that works on chicken eggs and all that kind of stuff. And then on chocolate products, right? You have to source them in a certain kind of way. It just creates a lot of havoc that makes it difficult for all of us even to be able to respond. And then not knowing what the consumer really wants. And does that product, is there either not enough of it or is there too much of it, right? That's what we're facing here, right?
Yeah, definitely.
Great. So take us through the next example. That was really good. Thank you. That was awesome.
Yeah. So this second case study is with Alto. So this relates to the planning challenge of how to balance cost and service when you have a difficult product. So in this case, the difficult product is potato chips. So bulky, fragile product with very fluctuating demand, highly volatile. And so Alto is a $113 million potato and veggie chips manufacturer in Europe. They have many customer brands they produce for, including the Brett's. And huge priority to their business is having high levels of customer service, so minimizing those stockouts. And when we worked with them, their market growth was 4% year over year. So some of the challenges associated with this difficult product are chips happen to be bulky and fragile, which means that they have high associated transport costs. They also have a short life, and because they're bulky, they have expensive storage costs. But also they have a strong seasonality and weather sensitivity. So when we think of potato chips, we think of a picnic food. So when the sun's out, it's nice in the summer, all of the chips fly off of the shelves. But when the weather isn't nice, they don't. So there's a huge weather sensitivity to the demand that leads to high volatility. And then since they value high levels of customer service and minimizing those stockouts, how to balance the conflicting planning objectives of minimizing the food waste while still avoiding the stockouts in spite of these highly volatile demand spikes. So the big overall question was for this manufacturer, how to optimize production, transport, and service cost while serving all of this volatile demand.
So you got the fleet. Can you go back real quick? I love those trucks on the road. So, and I'm thinking organic potatoes, right? Harvested at certain points in the year. So you got lead times they got to look at. They might be facing driver or fleet shortages, or there might be road conditions, infrastructure issues, and then seasonality factors too, right? Depending on, the weather and different climate factors that we face, like what happened in Texas and in the Northwest, right? That's a big part of it.
Yeah, there's many of those factors that lead to this kind of difficult balance for this particular product that we needed to address.
That's great. Thank you.
And so some of the key planning ingredients we threw into the planning problem for this client was making sure that production was planned well in advance. So summer, April to July was the high season for this product. But to meet the growing demand, a second production site was opened to complement the first one. And with the opening of that second production site, we had to support the capacity, the production, and customer allocation planning between those two production sites. So slightly more complex when you have two manufacturing sites, who will serve which customers. And we had to support the processes for creating, kind of solving that customer allocation problem. As well as, because of the highly volatile demand, we had to incorporate dynamic stock sizing rules to meet the demand when they had those spikes during the high season and picnic days, as well as keeping our eyes on the service and cost KPIs to make sure that they were hitting their targets despite the difficult demand. So the outcome of considering all these planning ingredients was, in spite of opening the second production site, we actually saw them increase their service levels. So their cycle service levels from 99.5% to 99.7%. And the reliability increased from 71 to 76. So that reliability measure is related to the probability of that perfect order.
Yeah, it definitely seems like you and DIAGMA really had this one nailed down. That's some pretty good improvements. Would you say, Pablo, from your experience?
Yeah, it's some great results.
Fantastic. Great job.
And so to recap how we addressed these two common planning problems with these two clients. So with the demand explosion problem, the game changer was to incorporate a medium-term forecast and use that as an input into the supplier contract development processes, as well as giving that forecast visibility to the suppliers of that distributor. And for the second case study, with the difficult potato chips product, making sure that production planning was well in advance to prepare for those expected demand spikes. And then also making sure that weather and seasonality was incorporated into that demand forecast to inform those dynamic stock sizing rules to minimize the chance of stock out while still avoiding exorbitant food waste.
Yeah, that's great. Good job. And this is the kind of work that you guys do, right? We are doing together, hopefully.
That's right. That's right.
Awesome. Love it. Okay, so we're reaching the end of our show. Thank you so much for joining us. We really appreciate it. Greg Foster, your host, Vision Analytics, Nathan Mays from DIAGMA. Pablo, would you like to give us your final thoughts? We really appreciate you joining the show today. And yes, Godiva chocolates, I have to confess, is one of my very favorites. It's so rich and delicious. And I can't wait to see the progress y'all are going to make.
And don't just buy it for, someone else. Make sure you enjoy it yourself.
Oh, it's for me. Oh, don't tell anybody. It's for me.
That makes a great gift, but it's also great for snacking. So, and
It
why,
is.
if you know Godiva is the best chocolate in the world, why just give it away? You should take part of it yourself. No, it's funny because I was listening to Nathan and both the things that he's talking about we're working on right now is expanding our view of what our forecast looks like beyond just the next 12 months, but what's the next 3 years look like so we can be ahead of our game. And then on top of that, the seasonality of the business, we have kind of a reverse seasonality from the potato chips, where potato chips sell enormously in the summer. We sell enormously in the wintertime during the holidays and Valentine's Day. So making sure that we pull up our production schedules and carry the right safety stock levels to be able to meet those demand times is critical. And like I said before, it all starts with the right forecast. If the forecast is right, then we can put the right plans in place. If you've got a volatile forecast, your entire team spends their time just chasing after the forecast and not being able to be proactive and look forward. So getting those right signals up front makes a huge difference into the world of the supply chain professional.
That's very good. And just to close on that point, I'm sure that Nathan and I would love to help you with that, because we know that it's a big problem, and that's what we're really here to help you solve. So without further ado, let's go to the last slides. Everybody knows how to reach us. Oh, I'm sorry, Nathan. You got to give me your final thoughts.
I have something to say. No.
Go for it.
Yeah, to add to the, I just like to revisit that the second ingredient of having an optimal operations planning, which is having a clear strategy. So that accurate forecast is great if that's coupled with a clear strategy about what makes sense in terms of cost versus service trade-off for your particular business. Knowing both of those things will enable you to have a optimal plan that works best and gives your business a competitive advantage to support the business strategy. So
yeah, and then being able to get those demand signals from different data sources, being able to take all of the inputs from your forecast, the S&OP team that has to put that together, the sales team that has to drive the forecast out in the field, being able to put everything in one place and be able to use the latest technology and a great team to be able to help you pull it all together so you can get that insight and information into a nice SaaS dashboard. Doesn't hurt either. Great. Awesome. So there's how you reach Pablo Cussatti at Godiva.com, myself, Greg.Foster, VisionAnalytics.com, and Nathan Mays at nmays@diagma.com. Gentlemen, thank you so much for your time today. We really appreciate it, and we look forward to catching up more later.
thanks for hosting, Greg. This was fun.
Okay,
Thanks, Greg.
have a great day. Well, welcome back. I know you had to do a lot of moves there, Pablo, so thank you so much for making the show today. We really appreciate it.
No, I appreciate being on.
Thank you.